Today is 20th August, and I'm going to begin this program by an apology for the late appearance of my video, and indeed several of our videos, yesterday. This was due to technical problems, which unfortunately are outside our own full control. We are confident that they will be resolved completely before the end of this week. They are affecting our ability to upload videos. I want to stress these are purely technical problems. They are in no way caused by any decisions that anybody has made. And in light of these technical problems, for the next couple of days, until I'm absolutely confident that this problem is fully resolved, and in order to mitigate some of the difficulties that we experienced yesterday, I'm going to try to the extent that I can to shorten my videos, which hopefully will make the process of uploading them swifter. I think it's better to do that than to keep people waiting for hours, if that can possibly be avoided. As I said, we are confident that this problem will have gone by the end of this week. Hopefully it will be resolved sooner than that, but in the meantime, that is the step that I'm going to take. Now, once again, I'm back to that perennial topic, which is the conflict in Ukraine, because even as I sometimes consider that it'd be a good moment to turn to other matters, the situation in the Middle East being perhaps the most pressing, we get more news from Ukraine, which makes that essentially impossible. Now, the first thing to say is that we have now had a very, very strong statement from the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. In fact, Lavrov has been giving a number of interviews to a number of Russian media channels. He gave one to Izvestia, but this one was given to Pavel Zarubin, who is one of Putin's favorite Russian journalists, and it was given for a television show which is specifically about President Putin's activities, and apparently it was made in Baku over the course of President Putin's visit to Baku being, of course, the capital of Azerbaijan, and it therefore must be seen as a statement made after discussion with Putin himself. Lavrov is, of course, accompanying, or has been accompanying, Putin to Azerbaijan. And the questions arose and are connected to that article in the Washington Post that I and others have discussed exhaustively. Eve Smith has talked about it in Naked Capitalism. There's a piece about it now by Simplicius the Thinker, and I've touched on it in 3 consecutive programs, and I was hoping after yesterday's program that I wouldn't have to talk about it any further. But Lavrov has been talking about it, about that Washington Post article, about negotiations supposedly underway between the Ukrainians and the Russians to come to some kind of mutually agreed ceasefire in the missile war, the energy war. And this is what Lavrov said. So the question that he was given was, what types of talks are completely off the table with the regime? And the question obviously refers to the Ukrainian government, the Kiev regime, as the Russians routinely now refer to it as. And Lavrov said this: after the start of the invasion of Kursk region, President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, made it clear that any talks are out of the question. I would like to highlight another important remark from President Putin. He said that we will certainly provide an assessment of the situation. That assessment will come at a later time. That's an implied warning, a threat to someone. Someone I'm guessing in the West, by the way, rather than in Ukraine. And anyway, we'll have to wait and see that means, I suspect, as I've said many times, that there's an awful lot going on behind the scene that we're not fully informed about. And I suspect that this comment of Lavrov's, which I'm going to return to, actually relates to something else that he said. Anyway, Lavrov then went on to say this. Recently, there have been rumours about clandestine contacts, including preparations for Qatar-mediated talks on Russian and Ukrainian energy facilities. There are also claims that our Turkish neighbours were considering mediating the issue of food security, particularly the context of ensuring freedom of navigation in the Black Sea. You can imagine the ulterior motives behind these ideas. All of this stems from the Burgenstock conference. Burgenstock was a place where the recent peace conference in Switzerland took place, the one the Russians weren't invited to, and the one which most of the global south stayed away from. Anyway, all of this stems from the Burgenstock conference, where it was decided to establish 3 working groups, one on energy, one on food, linked to maritime security, and one on humanitarian issues, prisoner exchanges, etc. These groups have been formed and their meetings are being prepared. However, any suggestion that Russia might be invited to participate is sheer nonsense. The Burgenstock process is entirely unacceptable to Russia, as its sole purpose is to advance an ultimatum disguised as Zelensky's formula. That is the peace proposal that Zelensky has made, which the Western powers have united behind, which demands the unconditional and complete withdrawal of all Russian forces from all of the territory of post-1991 Ukraine, including Crimea. In other words, a complete capitulation by the Russians, and then negotiations, which it is not clear what they will be about, but Zelensky has floated talk about payment by Russia of reparations and war crimes trials of Russian leaders and things of that kind, all of which, of course, as Lavrov says, as far as the Russians are concerned, would be completely unacceptable. So, interesting point about this comment of Lavrov's. He says that talks between Russia and Ukraine, directly or indirectly, are completely unacceptable. He also says that any negotiations, any discussions that take place within any part of the framework connected with the peace conference, or so-called peace conference in Switzerland, all the various discussions that took place, extending back to the process that was initiated in Copenhagen in August last year by the Western powers. Any of that, for the Russians, as far as the Russians are concerned, is unacceptable. The Russians see entering into such discussions as a trap intended eventually to lead them into a discussion and possible acceptance of Zelensky's peace plan. And the Russians will not do that, and that is absolute. They're not going to change their position on that issue. Now, the interesting thing about this comment of Lavrov's is that he doesn't actually deny that some discussions did take place in which the Russians might have been involved about a mutual cessation of the energy war. Now, a Russian journalist, or rather, he's not actually a journalist, an academic, but commentator, international affairs writer, a man called Kornikov, has suggested to the Russian newspaper Vedomosti that perhaps some level of expert discussions on this question might have taken place, In other words, technical people from the Russian side might have met informally with Ukrainian technical people from the Ukrainian side, maybe people from the respective energy systems, and there were some exchanges of view about this, but clearly nothing that might have amounted to a formal negotiation. And that, by the way, is very close to what was suggested by Eve Smith in that article in Naked Capitalism, that the West is talking up, rather the Washington Post is talking up this story about negotiations, making it appear that the negotiations were further advanced between the Russians, much further advanced between the Russians and the Ukrainians than they actually were, and that, in a sense, this story that appeared in the Washington Post is misleading. Well, that may be true, but Lavrov is now going much further. He's now saying that from this point onwards, there isn't going to be any talks at all, and that for the Russians, even engaging with the Ukrainians in talks is now dangerous, because it's the slippery slope that is going to draw the Russians towards an outcome that they categorically reject, which is acceptance of Zelensky's formula. So that's what Lavrov says. And he implies that the whole Qatar discussions, which, note again, he's not saying that some proposal for discussions in Qatar did not exist. He's implying that the whole question of the discussions in Qatar was essentially a trap in order to get the Russians to start talking along those lines, the Zelensky formula lines, which the Russians are rejecting. Now, this is somewhat consistent with a story that has appeared in Politico, which basically appears to originate from the Ukrainians, which suggests that the Ukrainians are not really wanting to enter into direct discussions with the Russians. What they want to do is to turn up and have meetings with various interested third parties, suggests to those third parties, put to those third parties various proposals, which on the face of it might sound reasonable, try in effect to trick these third parties. That's what Politico says, that's what I'm saying, but I'm taking it from what Lavrov is saying, trying to trick these third parties into setting themselves up as mediators, or thinking that they are engaging in some sort of mediation role, and then that begins some kind of process whereby the mediators start communicating messages to the Russians, and the Russians find themselves embarrassed and having to explain that really this isn't what they're interested in, which might be embarrassing for the third party, for the mediators. And this might explain some of the things that have been discussed about the Washington proposals, the Washington Post story about these mutual energy war ceasefire proposals. The story has claimed that even after the Russians indicated that they were not interested and would not turn up in Qatar and would not engage in any kind of discussions at all on this issue after the Kursk operation began, that the Ukrainians told the Qataris that they still wanted to come and begin the discussions, and that they would meet with officials from Qatar. But the Qataris said no, they're not interested. If the Russians are not involved and are not participating, then there is no point in Qatar putting itself in this very complex position of having to, and a potentially embarrassing position of being a mediator when one side is making clear that it is not interested in accepting its mediation. And I'm going to suggest that Lavrov's words, very, very gently, are also addressed at one other person. The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is now, it's now confirmed, will be visiting Ukraine and Poland over the next few days. The Indian Foreign Ministry says that this is a bilateral meeting. Obviously, the war will be discussed, but it's going to be primarily about fence mending and building up economic and trade links and doing that sort of thing. The Indian Foreign Ministry spokesman has said that, it's not a zero-sum relationship, that India maintains good relations with Russia. It also seeks to maintain good relations with Ukraine as well. In reality, the reason for this visit, and there's been commentaries about this, so I'm not guessing here. The reason for this visit is that directly after his recent re-election, Prime Minister Modi went to Moscow, had a very warm meeting with President Putin, was hugging Putin and was being hugged by Putin, and this elicited some very, very strong and negative words from Zelensky, which upset the Indians and caused the Indians to call in the Ukrainian ambassador and to hand him a protest note. But it also resulted in criticism of Modi and of India in the West. Now, Modi and the Indian government have been seeking to maintain a very complex game of equidistance between the Russians and the Western powers. On the one hand, Modi wants a good relationship with the United States. He wants good relations with the Western powers. He no doubt feels he needs that for economic reasons. He also undoubtedly believes, as I think many people in India do, that a strong relationship with the West gives India leverage in any discussions that India might have with China. And India is indeed, so it seems, moving forward soon to talks with China about trying finally to resolve the issue of the border. There have been many, many attempts at talks of this kind in the past, but this time it might be the case that the talks this time might be more successful. So Modi does not want to poison relations with the West, but the Western powers are very unhappy about the fact that India simultaneously wants to maintain good relations with Russia. Now, India wants to maintain very good relations with Russia for a number of reasons. Firstly, Russia is still India's main supplier of weapons. Secondly, Russia has now become India's main supplier of crude and, by the way, to some extent, refined oil. This has been a massive benefit for the Indian economy. India has been experiencing the same kind of inflation problems that most of the world has, which has had a significant impact on living standards in India. The probable reason why Prime Minister Modi's party did less well than some had expected in the recent parliamentary elections is because Indian voters have been under significant economic pressure because of this inflation. So Modi needs to keep the oil from Russia coming, because it is the oil that enables India to keep its energy costs down, preventing inflation from spiking further. And last but not least, and not to be discounted, India, like Russia, has extremely friendly relations, a very friendly, sympathetic outlook towards Russia going back decades, and of course on the Russian side it's the same. And Modi himself is on very friendly terms with Putin, and no doubt he values and wants to maintain that relationship. So Modi has to navigate through this very complex situation where various different parties want different things from India. The Russians want good relations with India, and they want trade with India, and they want India to continue to buy Russia's oil and weapons, and to develop economic links. The West wants India on side in its confrontation with China, and is becoming increasingly skeptical and critical of the fact that India is not making a wholehearted commitment to the West, and is particularly bothered by India's stance on the Ukraine issue. And India, of course, wants to preserve its independence and its room for manoeuvre. And this is why Modi is going to Kiev. He wants to balance his meeting with Putin with a meeting with Zelensky. That way he can tell everyone, the world, the West in particular, the Ukrainians too, that look, he's not taking sides. India is not taking sides in the war. It is generally seeking to maintain good relations, both with the Russians and, of course, with the Ukrainians, though in reality, the relationship with Russia is far more important. Now, what the Russians are saying, the message that Lavrov is ever so gently conveying here, is that if the Indians, however, find themselves being asked by the Ukrainians to act as mediators or as messengers, they should be extremely careful, because Russia is not at the moment interested in talks with Ukraine. If India finds itself in that position where it is accepting or appearing to take up Ukrainian proposals, then it is setting itself up for disappointment and embarrassment. And that is what Lavrov, in my opinion, is very gently doing in these comments. So there we are. I think we can now begin to see what has actually been going on, and it's fairly close to what Eve Smith was suggesting, or so it seems to me. There were discussions between the Russians and the Ukrainians about a mutual stand down in the energy war, but these were at a very low level, probably between company experts, not between diplomats. The Ukrainians then tried to talk up the story, make it appear that something more bigger was taking place, bounce the Qataris into acting as mediators in a process which Russia does not want to be involved in. And the Qataris, understanding what was going on, said no. So there we are. That, I think, is probably the most clear explanation of what is going on. There are no talks, substantive talks, going on between the Russians and the Ukrainians. I think that is now clear. I think Lavrov has made that position completely crystal clear. And I think that potential mediators like Modi have been warned off. Now, I ought to just finish on these diplomatic points by saying that one other person who is now in Moscow on a 3-day visit is Li Qiang, the Prime Minister of China. He has been sent there, obviously, by the Standing Committee of the Politburo and by President Xi Jinping. From what I understand, this is mostly an economic and trade visit. It's all about strengthening supply chains. Li Qiang is apparently going to be in Russia for something like 3 days. So we're looking at very, very lengthy and detailed talks. And interestingly, after Moscow, he's flying on to Minsk, where he's going to be meeting with Lukashenko. And Lukashenko also is in a position to fulfill Chinese needs in terms of raw materials, phosphates, all of that kind of thing, and some types of heavy machinery. And anyway, it does, as I said, all look as if the main focus of all of this visit is supply chains. And all of this is happening, by the way, as To Lam, the new leader of Vietnam, is also in China. He's been meeting with Xi Jinping. Again, it all looks like the primary purpose of the visit is to develop the relations between the Chinese and Vietnamese economies and to push forward to further integration. And I think all of this is connected with a recent decision that the Chinese have taken, which is to stop antimony exports. Antimony is a mineral that is used in all kinds of applications, from the computer industry to weapons manufacturing to whatever. It's one of those indispensable minerals, and the Chinese and their allies, Russia and some of their other allies, control around 90% of production, of output of antimony. Now, I don't think that the Chinese are doing this as a sanction so much against the West. I think this is part of their own process of stockpiling and in preparation for a potential economic war that they are nervous about. And I think that the Chinese are also sorting out, toughening, hardening their supply chains as part of these discussions. As part of these discussions, and that all of these things, the meetings in Vietnam, in Russia, in Belarus, the meetings with the leaders of these countries are all interconnected with each other. Now, all of this is with the BRICS summit meeting in Kazan, now only a few weeks away. And of course, we're getting reports that one of the major things that's going to happen there is that further steps are going to be taken to advance the development of trading, economic and trading and monetary systems. So India, it appears, instead of being, as many expected, the weak link in this chain, appears for the moment to be keen on pressing forward with it. And that, of course, also gives Modi an additional reason, given that he knows that whatever is going to come out of the Kazan meeting is not going to be looked on with favour in the United States. Anyway, it gives him more reason, I think, to make sure that his position diplomatically is covered and that he's not going to be accused of simply taking Putin's side. So anyway, let's move on to the other comment that Lavrov made. He said that the Russians will provide an assessment of the situation, that is to say the Kursk operation, and that assessment will come at a later time, which is seemingly quite an ominous statement. And then we need to go now to another part of the same interview, because Lavrov made some rather interesting points about who was ultimately behind the military operation in Kursk. He was asked this question: what do you think about the West's rhetoric and stance on the situation in our border regions? They are denying that they knew about it. And then Lavrov says this: the Defense Ministry leadership assesses the military situation and reports to President Putin several times a day. As for the political side, it's clear that the cap fits and they should long be wearing it. The evolution from "we have nothing to do with it" and "no one asked us" to "they did ask, but we said no" and "Zelensky disobeyed" is just ridiculous. Everyone is perfectly aware that Zelensky would never have dared to do this. The decision was certainly not just his. Now he boasts that he's creating a buffer zone and damaging the Russian state. He would not have dared to do this unless he had orders from the United States. There is also no doubt that Washington is behind the Nord Stream explosions, which cut Europe off from Russian fuel and consequently a stable foundation for economic growth. For us, the picture is crystal clear. For all their dodging, the truth is obvious and known to all objective and unbiased observers. So what Lavrov is saying is, the Americans may be pretending that they didn't know anything about the Kursk operation, but on the contrary, it was they who instigated it. They are the people who are behind it. Now, before I just go on with this, there's an article which has appeared in the Sunday Times, it's appeared on Sunday, which many commentators are seeing as a British admission that it was Britain rather than the United States that allegedly planned with the Ukrainians the commissioning of the Kursk operation. Now, I read that article on Sunday. I've read it again since, after reading all of these commentaries, and I don't really see that at all. I don't think that this is in any shape or form what the article says. It does talk quite a lot about the Kursk operation, though not perhaps with quite the optimism that some of the claims that have been made about this article might suggest. But mostly it is about the British attempt to try to get Britain's Western allies to agree to the use of long-range missiles to attack targets in Russia. And there is even a quote from Dr. Michael Clark that unless the Ukrainians are able to launch missile strikes at Russian air bases with long-range missiles, then the Kursk operation at some point is going to fail. So I think that this is what this article is about. It is not about British ownership of the Kursk operation at all. In fact, the article, as far as I can see, implies that it's Ukraine that launched this operation on its own, but the Russians don't believe that. They think that the American fingerprints are all over it. And of course, they will have intelligence, they have information, which no doubt corroborates that. That doesn't mean necessarily, by the way, that they are right, but I have no doubt that that is what they believe. And I'm going to make a guess that this assessment that the Russians are preparing is going to be on precisely that topic. The Russians are going to come forward and they're going to say that the Americans were behind the attack on Kursk and that it was the Americans and no one else who was ultimately involved in what the Russians now straightforwardly say was the original plan of the operation to seize the nuclear power plant in Kursk, near Kursk, and to engage in what the Russians would say is nuclear terrorism. So the Russians are working towards, in my opinion, making these rather extraordinary, rather strong accusations against the United States. Now, as to the question of whether the objective, the Ukrainian objective, was the nuclear power station in Kursk, we have had a most interesting comment from Group of Forces North. Now, their latest summary of the situation on the battlefields, I'm not going to discuss it in any great detail. It doesn't actually cover many new topics. From what I can tell, the fighting in Kursk region continues to be confined to essentially the same places we've been hearing about. The Group of Forces North report this time corresponds very closely with the Russian Defense Ministry's report, which I'm going to turn to in a moment. But Group of Forces North does make this really very interesting claim about the operation in Kursk region, and it closely tallies with what Lavrov has said about who its planners were. And I suspect that that's not complete coincidence. So this is what Group of Forces North are telling us. Western curators, that's to say the people who manage Ukraine's war, are trying to disavow the offensive in Kursk region. In Kursk region, the Ukrainian command wanted to achieve two goals: to seize the nuclear power plant in Kurchatov and to force Russia to withdraw a significant contingent from the Pokrovsk and Toretsk directions. Neither goal was achieved, and now the Western curators, who undoubtedly participated in the preparation of the adventure, declared that they are not guilty of the failure. This is reported by Western mouthpieces, the New-York Times, The Economist, and a number of other publications. I'm going to say straight away, I cannot believe that military people working for Group of Forces North are devoting time and energy reading Western newspapers. I must assume that, as I said, the insertion of this statement into Group of Forces North's website has come as a result of a political decision in Moscow. Just say. But anyway, continuing. According to their sources, the curators of the Kiev regime did not know about the operation being prepared and could not have participated in any way in the preparations, which were allegedly carried out by the Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Syrsky, with a number of close generals. Thanks to the coordinated and prompt actions of Group of Forces North, the offensive was stopped, and now Western curators have to deny their involvement in order to save their reputation and at the same time collect new aid packages in a desperate attempt to save the Ukrainian Armed Forces group from destruction. Now, notice that this straightforwardly says that there was a plan to seize the Kursk nuclear power plant and that the Western powers were party to it. So I think we are now being given strong clues as to what the Russian assessment is going to be. Now, let me stress again, these are all comments that come ultimately from Russian sources. So it may be that the Russians are putting 2 and 2 together and making 10. It may be that the Russians are making all this up for propaganda reasons because they want to convey all of this type of thing to their friends in Beijing and Delhi and Ankara and Brasilia and wherever. Or it could be that the Russians are simply wrong and that they believe something. They believe that the Western powers have greater control over what goes on in Kiev than they actually do. But in a sense, what the Russians believe, and whether they're right or wrong to believe it, may not be as important as what they are now saying. They're saying, in effect, that the Western powers were parties to what the Russians have assessed was an act of nuclear terrorism or attempted nuclear terrorism. That may be wrong. It might be misinformation. I'm not saying. I don't know. But this is what they're saying. And given that the Russians are taking this stance, I think it is inevitably going to affect the conduct of the Russians in the future. And it probably also goes far to explain why the Russians at the present time are taking this very strong stance now of refusing all further talks. Now, that brings me to the situation on the ground. Now, I'm going to now turn to what the Russian Defense Ministry is telling us, not about the situation in Kursk specifically, but about the entire situation in the area of the special military operation. Because the most important piece of news that the Russian Defense Ministry has given us today is that New-York has been fully captured by the Russian military. And this is what the Russian Defense Ministry says. As a result of active operations by the Center Group of Forces units, a large group of the enemy troops were defeated, and one of the largest settlements of the Toretsk agglomeration and a strategically important logistics center, Novgorodske, has been liberated. Novgorodskoye is, of course, New York. Novgorodske is the name New York was given by the Soviet Union in 1951. It continues to be the name that the Russians give to New York. I ought to say that the name New York is not a Ukrainian invention, as I believe I once claimed in a program I might have made some months ago. It is in fact the historic name of this small town. Apparently, New York was already known as New York as far back as the 1850s, and there is huge debate and discussion and controversy as to why that might have been the case, which I'm not going to waste time on. Anyway, the point is New York, all of it, the residential areas, the industrial area where the phenol plant, one of the factories in this area, all of it is now under Russian control. New York is sometimes referred to as a village. In fact, I have spoken of it as a village myself. But in fact, it is a small town. Its population was before the war around 10,000 people. It is, in other words, twice the size of Suja, the place that the Ukrainians captured or have claimed to have captured in Kursk region. We'll come to that later. So it's not a small place, not a tiny place. It's a small town, similar size as Marinka, Krasnogorovka, Avdeevka, those sort of places. Chasov Yar. It's another one in this sequence of towns of roughly that size that the Russians have captured since they began their offensive in Donbass way back in October of last year. And of course, it was another very heavily fortified position, and having, of course, captured New York, and by the way, I'm going to continue to refer to it as New York, even though Novgorodskoye might seem to be a more logical choice now. But I'm going to continue to refer to it as New York because I doubt that I will have much cause to refer to this place very much from now on. And if I start calling it by a different name, it will just create further confusion. But anyway, the point is, New York has fallen, Zalizny has fallen. The Russians control one of the coal mines that were between their positions and Toretsk itself. The Russians are likely now, with New York having passed entirely under their control, soon to be in control of the other coal mine, which they have largely surrounded. Their forces have broken into Toretsk, and all the reports suggest that they're advancing fast into Toretsk. Again, I want to stress, I'm not saying that Toretsk itself is about to fall. It will probably take some weeks of fighting, might even take longer than that, but it will probably take some weeks of fighting before the Russians are able to clear Toretsk completely. But the direction of travel, as I often say, is now clear. I don't see how the Ukrainians can turn this round. And, well, we've had a report from the Russians about the fact that the Ukrainians have been deploying their forces from places like Toretsk and indeed Pokrovsk, which we're going to come to, and they've been sending them to Kursk. They're sending everything they have, apparently, to Kursk. And this is the report that TASS published this morning. Ukrainian forces have moved their most battle-ready units from the front line in Donetsk, People's Republic, to the Kursk area, a law enforcement officer told TASS. The enemy has removed its most capable units from the front line in the Donetsk People's Republic. Those have been moved to the Kursk region, to Sumy. And according to the source, Ukraine has pulled them from near Krasnoarmeysk, which is to say Pokrovsk. Krasnoarmeysk is the Soviet and also Russian name for the town I will continue to refer to as Pokrovsk, Rodinskoye, Konstantinovka, and a number of small localities. Konstantinovka is, of course, the next big place, population around 70,000. Once Toretsk and Chasiv Yar fall, if Chasiv Yar and Toretsk are captured by the Russians, and all the indications are that they will be, at some point within the next few weeks, the next Russian advance will be northwards and westwards towards Konstantinovka, and somewhat astonishingly, the Ukrainians are pulling back their troops from Konstantinovka and are redeploying them to Sumy region and to Kursk. And, well, what is going on elsewhere on the battlefronts? Firstly, if we go to TASS, they're telling us that the situation for the Ukrainians in the Kupiansk area is now critical. Yesterday, we saw that the Russian Defense Ministry has said that the Vyemka railway station close to Siversk has now been captured by the Russians. The Russians are converging on Siversk from multiple directions. Apparently, one of the reasons why has taken them a long time to get to Siversk is because Siversk is on an elevation, so they have to sort of move upwards. But it seems that is what they have now doing. The Vyemka railway station is located on the same plateau as is Siversk itself, and with the Russians in control of it and advancing along the railways, it looks like they'll be able to move towards Siversk more quickly from now on. And if you again look at the map, as I spoke yesterday, it's difficult to see how the Ukrainians are going to be able to hold out in Siversk for very long. The problems of supply that they're going to face, I think, are going to be very difficult. So that's the situation in Siversk. But it seems that the Ukrainians are also running into problems in all sorts of other places as well. So the Russians are also saying, and this is from our old friend Andrei Marochko, former Lugansk official. Now he's a military expert. But anyway, he's told TASS that in the Kupiansk area, the Ukrainians are retreating. They're trying to dodge shelling attacks using civilians as cover. Supposedly, Ukrainian forces are being pushed back in all of this area. Over the past few days, we have managed to move forward and improve, this is Marochko, improve our tactical position in Peshanoye, Stelmachova, Nevskoye and Makeyevka, and in Terny. Remember Terny, where the Ukrainians were supposed to have won a famous battle a few weeks ago? Well, the Russians are back. Russians have also managed to push the enemy out of 3 fortified areas. This is what Marochko is telling us. And of course in Makeyevka, as I discussed yesterday, the Russians have crossed the Zherebets River and are fighting the Ukrainians on the West Bank. So it looks as if we are now looking at a major Russian advance towards the Oskol and Zherebets river lines. The Ukrainians are not defending or unable to defend their positions along these two rivers anymore. That in fact the Ukrainian defenses in northern Donbass are crumbling, and presumably an advance towards Liman across the Zherebets River and an advance towards Kupiansk itself and maybe subsequently towards ETHEREUM beyond the Oskol River are now again coming firmly over the horizon. Now, the other place where there's been enormous amount of fighting, and by the way, a lightning Russian advance, is the Pokrovsk area. And we continue to get news of all kinds of villages and positions falling under Russian control in the area of Pokrovsk. It's been the Ukrainians have now announced, they've now apparently given a definite order for all civilians to evacuate the entire Pokrovsk conurbation. Pokrovsk itself, Mirnograd, and other locations around it. Around 80,000 people are to be evacuated from this urban area, and the Ukrainians are apparently saying that they want everybody out within 2 weeks, which suggests to me that they expect that the assault on Pokrovsk is going to begin within about 2 weeks. Now, Rinat Akhmetov, the Ukrainian oligarch, said that the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians heavily in the Pokrovsk sector. The TASS, the officer who spoke to TASS, said that the Ukrainians have redeployed their troops their best troops from the Pokrovsk sector to Kursk. Looks as if the Kursk operation is absolutely an all-for-nothing gamble. It's a last throw of the dice. The hope still seems to be that something can be achieved in Kursk, because I have to say, it's starting to look as if Zelensky and Syrskyi and other officials in Kiev might be preparing to write the whole of Donbass off. They might have come to a decision that it's going to be impossible to hold on to Donbass militarily for much longer. And given that that is so, there's no further point in trying to resist in Donbass, and it might be better instead to try to use the best troops that Ukraine still has to try to achieve some kind of dramatic event in Kursk, which could conceivably still change the situation in Ukrainian favour. Anyway, as to what is going on the actual front lines in the area of Pokrovsk, there were reports yesterday, not fully confirmed, that there is now fighting underway in the small town of Novogrodivka, which would suggest, if it is true, that the Russians have now bypassed these, moved beyond these coal mines and slag heaps, which some people believe might form a natural defence line. I think if the Ukrainians had had years to prepare these coal mines and slag heaps and build a proper fortified positions there, then this might indeed have become a serious obstacle for the Russians. Though it's worth pointing out that the Russians now have very considerable operational space on this territory, and apparently they outnumber the Ukrainians very heavily. And as Rinat Akhmetov said, they could quite easily, if they wanted to, bypass this line of coal mines and slag heaps and outflank the Ukrainians from the south. And perhaps that's precisely what they're going to do, or maybe that's what they're doing. I'm not going to discuss this further. But anyway, the point is that apparently there's fighting going on in Novogrodovka. The Russians have apparently completely cleared all the villages to the east and south. They've apparently moving south towards capturing places like Ptikhe and Kalinova, and it's likely that very soon they'll be cutting the E50 road. It's been suggested that the Ukrainians might try to form a defense line along this road, but a road can be a defense line, obviously. It's probably on a slightly higher ground, though I suspect it's not quite as formidable a barrier as a railway track. But I doubt, to be honest, that the Ukrainians can hold the Russians for very long along this road. It's not like the situation near Stepovoye and Berdichi during the fighting close to Avdiivka, where the area where the Russians had to break through in order to pass the railway was quite confined. The Russians, as I said, have ample maneuver room, and I can't see how the Ukrainians can hold the entire stretch of this road for very long. So the Russians can outflank the Ukrainians, and perhaps that is what they're doing. And there are also reports that the Russians have made further progress in Grodivka, which is along the main road to Pokrovsk itself, and that there's been a further Russian advance both inside and around Grodivka, and that the Russians might actually have begun a battle for a village called Novoekonomichne, very typical Soviet name, by the way, which is actually located directly on the road between Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka. So, the Ukrainians perhaps preparing to write off Donbass, accepting that the battle of Donbass is lost. And there are some rather extraordinary statements being made by various Ukrainian officials. One Ukrainian official, the deputy defense minister, has made a remarkable claim about the size of the Russian armed forces. He says that the Russian forces operating on the territory of the special military operation were 440,000 at the start of this year. That's the time when the battles for Avdiivka were underway. They have now grown to 600,000. By the end of this year, they will be 800,000. Now, we don't know the size of the Ukrainian army exactly, but there are guesses that it is probably numbers around 300 to 350,000. So we can see the enormous preponderance of men and machines that the Russians are now achieving. And there's been another report, which I read yesterday, which is connected to the reports coming from Germany that a cash-strapped German government, at the insistence of the finance ministry, the German finance ministry, led by the FDP leader, Christian Lindner, has decided that it cannot afford additional military aid for Ukraine, including, importantly, supply of air defense missiles, and that the point of further military supplies for Ukraine is now, from Germany, is now coming to an end. There's been, I have to say, something of a shock. This has created something of a shock on the part of Ukrainian supporters. There's been significant amount of criticism of this decision. I read one supporter, I think it was Timothy Garton-Ash, but I might be wrong about this, say that Ukraine is being sacrificed to Germany's debt break. Well, that is probably true, but it's important to remember that the debt break is part of Germany's constitution, and German governments might risk negative decisions from the German Constitutional Court if they don't implement it, and that if they start cutting further infrastructure and welfare payments and make other economies, that might also have a long-term, actually an important electoral effect within Germany, which is due to have important elections, parliamentary elections, I understand, next year. So we might be coming to the end of what the Germans realistically can do. Now, I think we must be careful because obviously we've heard reports of this kind before, and some funding and money does come up. But anyway, there have been reports coming from Ukraine that if there is now a cessation of further Western military supplies, and I've noticed, by the way, that the supply packages from the United States over the last few weeks have become few and far between. There was a burst of supplies immediately following the vote in Congress back in April, but it looks as if the US has run through what it could give to Ukraine fairly fast. Anyway, the Ukrainians are saying that unless supplies are resumed at an even greater level than before, then within 60 days, the Ukrainians will have run out of pretty much everything, and that further resistance will become impossible. Well, if all of this is correct, and one has to be very careful because we've heard these stories before, and the Ukrainians are almost certainly overstating things. But if all of this is even partially correct, and we can see the movements on the front lines in Donbass, one can begin to understand better the Kursk operation. Now, there has been some very trenchant criticism of the Kursk operation. One came in the Hill, and it was written by Andrew Latham. I'm not going to read it out, but it says that Ukraine's Kursk offensive is a huge strategic error. It's scathing about Zelensky. It says Zelensky has proved himself a master of the political stage, a gifted orator, capable of stirring emotions and garnering global support. However, his recent military incursion into Russia marks a departure from the realm of diplomacy and into the territory of strategic blunder. The reckless gambit, more akin to a desperate stunt, worthy of a second-rate actor than a seasoned statesman, diverts critical resources from the primary battlefield while offering negligible strategic gain. Which is, of course, what I have been saying for the last 2 weeks. Just saying. Anyway, that's Andrew Latham in the Hill. We have had a much more considered, but I think in some ways even more impressive discussion of this. whole issue of the Kursk offensive from George Beebe. In my opinion, one of the outstanding commentators within the mainstream of the conflict in the United States. I have to say, I frankly wish we had some people like that here in Britain. But anyway, George Beebe, the hazards of Ukraine's incursion into Russia. And he then says that though the operation seems to have blindsided the Kremlin, leading to the capture of some 30 villages and forcing the evacuation of roughly 200,000 people, the reality is that it has generated an impressive amount of optimistic takes on Western opinion pages and talk shows, but it has not ultimately achieved anything. So far, the Russian that's the last words are mine, by the way, not George Beebe's, just to make clear. So far, the Russian military has not moved large numbers of troops into Kursk from the primary fronts in Donbass, Zaporozhye and Kharkiv. Rather, it has relied on substantial numbers of combat reserves that it has held back from Ukraine, coupled with airstrikes on Ukrainian armor. This has effectively prevented Kiev from diverting its already stretched manpower from the front lines in Ukraine. Well, it's not prevented, it's effectively compelled, I think he means, from the front lines in Ukraine to reinforce its initial success in Kursk. And he then goes on to say that Ukraine moved air defense assets close to the border, but this exposed their position to devastating Russian strikes. And as a result, Ukraine's rapid early advances have now slowed substantially, raising profound doubts about its capacity to hold captured territory for very long. And he then goes on to say that had Ukraine managed to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant, one of the largest in Russia, its bargaining power might have grown quite substantially. The Russian military would have been hard-pressed to dislodge forces holding the plant without damaging or destroying the facilities. But Ukrainian forces have fallen far short of reaching that objective and have little prospect of attaining it now that Russia has mobilized forces to defend the plant. Again, you've heard all of that from me. I would point out that George Beebe is a former director of the CIA's Russia analysis section, and he was also staff advisor to Vice President Cheney. So, he probably knows things. He probably has access to information that I don't have. And beyond that, he is in all respects, arguably, a much more qualified analyst than I am. So it's always gratifying to see that a person like that has come to the same conclusions as me. Anyway, he then goes on to say, if the Kursk incursion was meant to embarrass Putin and turn up the political pressure inside Russia for ending the war, that too seems unlikely. Past Russian battlefield setbacks had little impact on Putin's polling numbers. Putin arguably emerged strengthened from his suppression of the Wagner uprising. And he then discusses the situation in Russia, and he talks about the risks for Ukraine of conducting this operation. He says that ultimately Ukraine might capture, the Kursk incursion has shown that Ukraine can still capture headlines, but securing large amounts of Russian-held territory and shifting the course of the war seems to be beyond its reach. And I think that is absolutely right. Now, going back to that article in the London Times, the Sunday Times, which I talked about before, I ought to say that there is an observation made in it which, so far as I can see, most have overlooked. And that is that The priority now for the Ukrainians is clearly not to try to capture more territory simply for the purpose of holding territory, but rather to try to hold on to what they have if they are going to use it as any kind of bargaining chip. And it contains this paragraph. What happens next depends on the game of military cat and mouse. The assumption is that Russia will counterattack at Kursk before winter sets in at the end of October. Western analysts agree that the Ukrainians will not want to try to hold all the ground they have taken. Now, I said in my program yesterday that a very large number of Russian troops are currently on furlough. It seems that they will be coming back and joining the army over the course of the autumn, and that the forces, the regiments in this area will be fully up to strength by some point in October, and that is apparently the time when the British think the major counterstrike in Kursk will happen. I don't believe that the Ukrainians can hold on in Kursk if the entire force of the Russian army is thrown against them. So to me, it looks as if over the course of October, late October, November, we will probably see the end of this affair. Note that that will be happening at roughly the same time as the American presidential elections. And note also that it is likely to be happening at a time when the crisis in Donbass has fully matured. So that now brings us to what is actually going on in in Kursk at this particular point in time. And the Russian Defense Ministry has provided us with its account, which, as I said, is so similar this time, in my opinion, to the account from Group of Forces North, that it's the one I'm going to focus on today. It says units of Group of Forces North have thwarted attempts by the enemy's assault detachments to launch attacks near Borki, Korenovo, Kremyanoye and Ruskaya Kanapelka. Ukrainian losses amounted to more than 60 troops killed and wounded, 2 tanks, 8 armoured fighting vehicles and 6 motor vehicles. The Russian military continues reconnaissance and search operations to locate and eliminate the enemy's small sabotage and reconnaissance groups in forest belts who attempt to get to the depths of Russian territory. Notice that they give no locations, and I get the sense that the days when Ukraine was able to send reconnaissance groups deep into Russian territory are gradually ending. The Russians talk about a Ukrainian attack towards Korenovo, and they talk about another Ukrainian attack northwards towards Kremyanoye, and another Ukrainian attack eastwards towards Ruskaya Karapelka. But they say that all of these attacks were unsuccessful. Now, there have been other reports, that the Ukrainians have actually achieved more successes over the last 24 hours. And perhaps they have, but if so, it's always in the same places that we've been hearing about for some time. And I have to say that despite some film and photographic evidence that people are producing, I'm going to be a little careful about accepting some of these reports. To give one example, there's claims that a village called Vizhnevka has just been captured by the Ukrainians. This, I believe, is located close to Korenovo, this village. I can't find it on the map myself. The trouble with that is that I distinctly remember that the Ukrainians claimed to have captured Vizhnevka about a week ago, And in fact, it was reported by many people as being captured by the Ukrainians. And I just checked this morning on Wikipedia, and it still says that the Ukrainians captured Vishnevka a week ago. Now, maybe they did capture Vishnevka a week ago, and maybe the Russians pushed them out, and then maybe the Ukrainians have just pushed the Russians back out again and have regained control. Maybe something like that has happened, but it's difficult to be clear. And I would be careful before jumping to conclusions. The Russians are now saying that, or to be precise, Group of Forces North is now claiming that it captured in some village a group of Ukrainian soldiers who'd entered the village purely for the purpose of filming themselves there and then retreating with the impression that the village in question had thereby fallen under Ukrainian control. Now, that's what Group of Forces North say. It may not be true. I don't know. But anyway, one way or the other, this is what the Russians are telling us. And their reports suggest that the situation continues to be much as always. In other words, that the Ukrainians are not making any progress at all. Another person, by the way, who said the same thing is Abdi Al-Aldinov, who continues to be a very busy commentator about what is going on the battlefronts in Kursk. And he says that the enemy is currently stopped and suffering losses due to the coordinated forces, actions of the Akhmat Special Forces, as well as the 810th Marine Brigade, the 30th Regiment and the 2nd Special Forces Brigade. That appears to be, by the way, the totality of the forces that are engaging the Russians. So we have the Akhmat forces, special forces, which number several thousand men, the 810th Marine Brigade, about 4,000 men, a force called the 30th Regiment, is that maybe the tank unit that we were hearing about, and the 2nd Special Forces Brigade, which is a mysterious entity which I'm not going to speculate about. Significantly smaller force than the 4 to 6 brigades that the Ukrainians are alleged to have in this area. Just saying. But the Russians then tell us that they are busy bombing Ukrainian positions, and they give a list of places where they're bombing them. And again, they all look to me to be essentially the same places as before. Apasanovka, Borki, Viktorovka, Kozitsa, Lyubimovka, Plekhovo, Tolsty Lug, and others. And they also talk about how they've conducted air and missile strikes on the Ukrainians in various positions. And again, they look fairly close to being where these strikes were before. And then they give us a list of losses. And they say that over the course of the last 24 hours, Ukrainian losses amounted to 350 troops, 25 units of hardware, including 4 tanks, 1 infantry fighting vehicle, 2 armoured personnel carriers, 18 armoured fighting vehicles, as well as 8 motor vehicles, 2 mortars, and 1 electronic warfare system. And they're now putting total Ukrainian losses at 4,130 men, dead and wounded, 58 tanks, 27 infantry fighting vehicles, and 50 armoured personnel carriers. Now, again, there is a divergence between the armoured vehicle, the armoured losses, and the infantry losses, but we see that both are high. Anyway, my impression is that the battle in Kursk, the front lines here continue to stagnate. The Russian newspaper, Redovka, gave a very interesting analysis of the fighting in Kursk yesterday. They said that what the Ukrainians have created is a bubble. They described it as a bubble of territory that they control, including the part of Suja that they control. The Russians still deny that the Ukrainians control all of Suja, and certain stretch of territory to the west. But they don't have a firm control over all of it. And all of these Ukrainian attacks that have been taking place, the attacks towards Korenovo, the attempts to attack westwards, the destroying of the bridges on the Seine River, and the reports that the Ukrainians might be intending some kind of advance into the territory south of the Seine River, that all of this, what it's really intended to do is to give the Ukrainians space to create strong points and to establish some degree of strategic depth in order to try to hold their positions in Kursk when, in a few weeks' time, the big Russian counterstrike eventually comes. And the Ukrainians are struggling to do this, and they're not so far being very successful. And in the meantime, they continue to suffer these terrible losses. Well, a more important takeaway from all of this is that, as I said, it does seem as if the Ukrainians are starting to despair about Donbass, which is fascinating because I cannot believe now that the decision to deploy troops from Donbass to Kursk isn't being made intentionally. Now, what exactly that means in the long term, how all of this is going to play out, is difficult to see. But it does look as if the Ukrainians, having despaired of Donbass, are still hoping to achieve something in Kursk. Unclear to me what. And one can perhaps understand the urgency now with which, to go back to the points I made at the start of my program, they're trying to entangle the Russians in some sort of negotiation process. The Russians see all this, they understand it, their vision is no longer obscured by what the Ukrainians are up to. They're no doubt busy trying to explain this all to their friends in Delhi and Beijing and wherever. I think that by now the Russians have bought themselves enough credit and understanding from their friends to be able to keep going. And I suspect that by some point in the autumn, some fairly decisive things in this war will have started to happen, in Donbass specifically, and we will see how the West reacts to that. Anyway, this program has gone on for all the same length of time that my other programs have done. It's very difficult, I find, to limit discussion in time terms when the amount of information is so large and there's so many topics to talk about. But anyway, there it is. This is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget also to check out our shop, where you'll find all the amazing things that we have there. And last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.